Welcome to the Muddy Waters Podcast, where Mainers tell their stories, unfiltered.
Good afternoon, I guess good evening, Maine. This is Chuck Ellis. As you will have noticed, we have a new fun little intro to the Muddy Waters Podcast where we help the people of Maine better understand what's going on, typically by talking a lot about what's going on here in the state of Maine. But every now and then we like to mix things up. And so we're fortunate tonight to have with us Forrest Robinson. I want to be like of the but who has written, this is how we'll put it this way, who has written for the Federalist and the Maine Wire, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I had a piece that was republished in the Maine Wire. Yep.
Yeah. So very distinguished individual, young man. But yeah, Forrest, thanks for coming back on and being with us. I just feel like we always have really good conversation. And even though I'm like almost twice your age or something like that, I feel like I'm also like, learning things along the way. So it's always fun to chat.
Likewise.
Yeah. So there's a number of I think things what led to, I think, the planning of this episode in particular was like some fun things that I was kind of seeing, and like you could make an argument that in some ways many of us, without even knowing it in certain ways, are programmed by for so many years. It's hard to be in a culture and not be impacted by what the culture is trying to make you believe, if that makes sense. And so I remember I saw somebody make a post in relation to something else that I think I had reposted something on X, and somebody else responded to that. And in their response, I was like, I don't know how I can take this in a way that's not, I'm trying to figure out how this is not racist. So rather than like respond to it, I sent it over to our mutual friend, Ryan, who was like, you should ask Forrest about that. And so that led to a conversation. And I feel like it's a worthy discussion. And it reminded me a little bit, as I was kind of telling you, I think in a similar conversation or in preparation for this or whatever, is that like, I've heard of the show on the Charlie Kirk show. They have like the heck is it called? Now I'm losing my thought, but thought crimes is the idea. Things that questions you're not supposed to ask and things you're not supposed to talk about. And I was like, that would be, anyway, it kind of feels like doing something in that vein would be kind of fun. And we kind of do that anyway on the podcast in general, as we, especially here in Maine, you're not supposed to talk about transgenderism and things like that, and we do it anyway. But either way, I thought that would be kind of a fun place to kind of start and have a discussion around and I think what it really relates to is like cultural shifts, because I think the post that I had referenced was a post where somebody was commenting on how America used to be, like, the culture here used to be a lot better, right? In America, the liberals would tell you it was always the worst that it could ever possibly be. America's like a terrible nation. That's kind of the painting that they want to make of America. But ultimately, like, if you look back at my grandfather's generation, America was a very stable place. You had you had great family units, and people worked together. You had a stable, healthy society in a lot of ways. And the guest on one of my episodes was attributing this to the fact that at that point we were a very Christian nation, right? And I think the counterpoint that was presented was basically that like almost every state was well over 96% white at the time. And like, I'm like, what, like, how, like, help me understand, like, that feels like that sounds a bit like a racist sentiment. Like, so what's going on there? And that's kind of what prompted, I guess, this conversation. So there we go. So then you started saying some things, and I was like, it is way too late at night. We should do a podcast about this sometime where I have brain function to be able to like grasp what the heck. And plus, it's better as a conversation rather than a text conversation. So, yeah.
Right.
So here we are.
So I guess I'll take it away. I mean, I think all of us can kind of agree that the America of today is qualitatively different from the America that our grandparents grew up in. Now, the question as to why that is, obviously, there's a bunch of different arguments for why America has changed so drastically. Um, and I read a great book kind of explaining why Trump got elected in 2016. That was such a huge upset that came out of left field, and it blew my mind. It blew so many people's minds. And the book is called "Alienated America" by Tim Carney. And throughout the book, he kind of goes, I mean, he focuses kind of on rural America or flyover country. That's kind of a derogatory term, but he talks a lot about how in places like in Appalachia, where JD Vance grew up in, I mean, the opioid crisis is just, it's horrific. I mean, here in Maine too, we see how bad it is, drug addiction, and kids illegitimacy rates have gone up for almost every single demographic group. So many people, young children, are growing up in single parent households. If you go back to like the 1950s, 1940s, that wasn't the case. Most divorce was very stigmatized. um Church attendance was much higher. People were proud to be American, and our reputation, both here in America and across the globe, we were seen as the shining city on a hill, as a beacon of hope. After World War II, we basically became the world empire, whereas, prior to this, England, with all of its colonies and whatnot, was seen as the global empire. The sun never sets on the British flag, they used to say. But after World War II, like, America became, the symbol of democracy, of just enlightenment, basically. And now, where did that all go wrong? Now, there's a bunch of different arguments for that. Some people trace it back, to like the 1960s. You had there's a great book called The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, where he basically talks about how a lot of Supreme Court decisions and intellectual movements, like with postmodernism and whatnot, coming out of academia in the 1960s, basically created this second constitution that was kind of superimposed over the original constitution. And this, a lot of judicial activism that had taken place and a lot of social movements that had taken place in the 1960s basically created an alternative vision of America, which was antithetical to, the founders' vision. And he basically blames the second constitution as, revolutionizing the country in a very negative way. Now, I definitely think there is a legal aspect to it. The left kind of has a very liberal interpretation of what the founding fathers talked about in, like, the Federalist Papers. They believe in a living constitution, whereas on the right, you have originalists, which believe more strongly in what the founding fathers believed in. So there's definitely like a legal component to it. Spiritually, there is also a reason why America has declined so much. I think a lot of that has to do with technology, just the wholesale transformation in living that has taken place, which has uprooted so many people. In the 20th century, there was this huge revolution in mass and scale, mass industrialization. Everybody, left their nice little rural town and moved into the cities. And then you had, white suburbia, where everybody commuted to work, and everybody had a car. The Ford Foundation made it possible for Henry Ford, I mean, made it possible for every American to own a car, and that had, huge implications for how cities were built, for how neighborhoods looked. No longer did you have third spaces or walkable cities. We no longer lived in a front porch republic, where your porch was in the front of your house, and said hi to your neighbors that you knew as they passed by. instead, we developed a back porch republic where, people grilled in the back of their house and they wanted to be left alone. And that, what I'm talking about right there, speaks to um, phenomenon that guys like Robert Putnam have written a lot about, the decline in community health in America over the past, he said 100 years. Um, he wrote this great book. He's a sociologist, Robert Putnam. He wrote this great book called Bowling Alone that talked a lot about how in America there's been this pervasive decline in community health. People aren't, you know, part of school boards anymore. They aren't going to town councils. They aren't in religious groups. They aren't really in any kind of fraternity or anything like that. People are just very secluded, kind of living in their own world. Um, and I think that's very true. Now, something else that's interesting that Robert Putnam talked about is diversity and how that affects communities as well. And of course, basically since the 1965 Immigration Act, which lifted a lot of the racial quotas, in the 1920s, there were a lot of regulations in place for our immigration system, which basically only allowed people, who were from Europe to, I mean, obviously you had a lot of Jews and Irish immigrants and Italians come over, but generally speaking, there were laws against, ethnic minorities from coming into America, but that changed under JFK I believe it was JFK, under the 1965 Immigration Act. And what we've seen since, the mid 60s is a complete unprecedented demographic transformation in America. And Robert Putnam, before I kind of go into the implications of that demographic transformation, he basically said in communities that have high levels of diversity, once the diversity reaches a certain level, a certain critical mass, people kind of develop this distrust toward one another. Um, and it makes sense, people want to be around people that look and act like themselves. It's a very basic human instinct. That's not to say it's always a good thing. I think we should be open to all people and treat everybody the same. But I mean, you know, irrespective of that belief of mine, it is true. I mean, you look in prisons, people self-segregate, people in schools self-segregate. It's just an aspect of human nature. But yeah, that was one of his observations, and it was very controversial at the time, obviously, because we're always taught like diversity is our strength, diversity is a good thing. America isn't a white country. You had the New York Times write that op-ed, the 1619 Project, talking about how blacks have been here since 1619. They've always been part of the American story. They've been here as long as the English have, and whatnot. But going back to what I was talking about earlier, so of course, there's been these judicial changes that have taken place. Very impact like desegregation in the 1960s, which was a good thing, obviously. But yeah, and all these social movements that took place, just America from the 60s onwards just transformed entirely. But with regard to immigration, and I think this is the controversial topic, is that since the 60s, America has basically been, the white portion of the population has been declining. And Patrick Buchanan, who's one of my favorite writers, political pundits, he worked in the Nixon administration. He actually ran for president at one time, but he was kind of kicked out of the Republican Party because he was more of a paleocon and less of, he wasn't like Bush or someone like that. He was more nationalist, before it was in vogue with Trump. But he wrote in his book "Suicide of a Superpower," talking about this decline in the white population. Now, people, when you talk about America becoming majority minority. It's, it's a very touchy subject. It's like, okay, well, is that a bad thing? Like, is it bad that there's more diversity? Is it bad that there's more Mexicans? Like, what are you getting at exactly? Um, well, I don't think it's a bad thing, but it has implications because historically, um, America has been, I mean, it was built on the English common law tradition, that goes back to the Magna Carta. And, it was a traditionally WASP country, white Anglo Saxon Protestant. Um, and as the white share of the population declines in number, America, our texture of life will change. And that, you could say that's a good thing, you could say that's a bad thing, but it will change. Um, and, all you have to know to realize that's the case is like in a lot of these countries, which, since the migration crisis in 2015 have experienced this, demographic transformation, like in Europe, um, their their life is completely different. Like in France, um, you have a lot of North African Muslims, which have, immigrated into the country. A lot of them are illegal. Um, you have people that believe in Sharia law. You have people that are willing to go to such lengths to assassinate people for, depicting Mohammed in a bad light, like Charlie Hebdo. He was a cartoonist in France, and his magazine place was attacked, because they had printed a magazine making fun of um, Muhammad. And just recently in France, there was a white girl who was beheaded by an illegal migrant. Um, and the father, just, dying of grief, killed himself. And you see a lot of this throughout the Western world. Just recently in Sweden, there was a young woman, 16 years old, who was raped also by an illegal migrant. And the illegal wasn't deported because the rape didn't last long enough. And I could go through all these stories, these anecdotes, but really what this tells us is that the people coming into our countries, into traditionally white countries, they have different values. And it's, I mean, whether that's religious, whether that's cultural, whether, who cares what it is? A lot of them have contempt for our values, which I wouldn't say are white values or black values, but they're Western values. And traditionally, Western countries like Britain, like America, like France have been white. And I don't think these countries owe their success to being white. But I do think, as white people, like, I mean, this is my opinion, but I don't want Britain to be 100% Indian. If Britain is 100% Indian, it's not Britain anymore. Similarly, if, Britain or if India became 100% British, the British actually did for a while have control over India, which, I don't think is a good thing, colonialism. But anyways, I digress. If it, if India was 100% British, it would cease to be India because at the end of the day, there is a component to nationalism, to patriotism that does have something to do with race. And people may think that smacks of white nationalism and whatnot, but really it's just a fundamental thing that I think all of us share, irrespective of what our skin color is. Like, I'm everybody deserves a land of their own, but for whatever reason, if white people want, Britain to remain not 100% white, but homogenous in the same way Japan isn't 100% Japanese, but still has a homogenous society. That's what I want. You know what I mean? So you can kind of take it away from there, but I kind
Well,
of just
it's an interesting conversation, right? And I feel like
yeah.
this is where the conversation was going that reminded me of like the whole thought crimes situation. Because like in America, to suggest that you think, well, in the the 21st century in the West, really, there is like I think I don't like I personally don't care if a nation remains more than 50% white, but I do care that the West is trying to teach white people to hate themselves and really trying to teach everybody to hate white people. Right.
Mm,
Like I have a huge problem with that. And I think like some of the things that you're talking about, I think are like I mean, the major problem that in bringing in mass migration, right?
mm,
Whether illegal or legal, is that if you have a culture, like think about the United States of America and the culture that I mean, America itself is culturally devolving. Um, Aside from the fact that we have a substantial number of people from other cultures that are coming into the country, right? So we were already headed in our own negative direction. Like divorce rates, which the family unit is like the like I think one of the most important like elements of a healthy society is a healthy healthy family units, like the nuclear family, right? It's one of the
mm,
what am I looking for? The foundations of a healthy society. And in America has been, I don't have the data in front of me, but for basically probably since a similar amount of time, since the 1960s, right, has been
right.
moving away from that because, it became viewed that that is like oppressive to women somehow. I don't know.
Mm,
Being in a healthy family unit with a loving husband and somehow is oppressive to women. I don't know. I
yeah.
don't understand that kind of logic, so I just kind of ignore it. But like anyway, so we've been devolving. But when you're dealing with immigration, right? Like, why are people coming to a country versus another country, right? Well, obviously, people are trying to get to America. I know this. Personally and experientially, right?
Mhm,
Because they see it as being a better place than where they are, right? They
mhm,
want to get there to be able to be a part of this great nation. A lot of times I'm referring to America these days as once great nation, and hopefully we can restore it to greatness.
mm,
But I think the problem lies when you're bringing in a bunch of people who have. So we're already headed in a negative direction, and our own cultural values breakdown is happening. And then you mix that in with the fact that we're bringing people from a bunch of different cultures, but we're not importing people, however you want to label that, but we're not bringing people in. People are not immigrating here from good places, in the sense that
mm,
they're not. I mean, they're beautiful countries, by the way. I've visited some of them, and they're beautiful countries themselves with beautiful people, but
mm,
there are serious cultural problems and governmental problems and behavioral challenges with some of these places, that that those cultural values don't mesh with historic American values that we already need to get back to. So
mm,
it's not has nothing to do really with race at all, and except when the liberals make it about race, because they're the
mm,
ones that bring this up. They're the ones that like I'm in a room a couple years ago for a Christmas party. Somehow, a comment that I made about Dirty Dancing being a chick flick, which it is, for the record. If
mhm.
anybody takes offense to that, go look up what a chick flick is and see if you don't see Dirty Dancing underneath the. But anyway, labeling Dirty Dancing as a chick flick, and somehow this led into a conversation about how isn't it true that most of the problems in the world are as a result of white men, and so basically don't all white men bear some of the responsibility for that? And I'm like, I've been like a powerless white male for the vast majority of my life. I don't
Yeah.
know how I could fix what some white idiot did 500 years ago. And so, no, I am not going to take responsibility for that nonsense. But again,
Chuck, you need to check your privilege. You need
yeah,
to check
check
your
my
privilege.
privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so for me, when I'm looking at all this stuff, I think the bigger issue, right, is culture and people coming from cultures that have different cultural values, and how like this is why when we're having an immigration policy, even if we had the infrastructure, which we don't, to
Mm.
handle like mass immigration, we have to consider the cost to our um, to our culture. Like if we bring so many people here, just it's like we've got a lifeboat, right? But if we put
Right.
too many people on the lifeboat, the boat sinks, right? And so like
Mm.
it's difficult for some people who have big hearts, and I'm one of them, right? Like I actually have a big I actually care about a lot of people. And like part of the problem with this like twisted ideology, aside from the culture stuff,
Mm.
is that America cannot take and handle and fix all eight, whatever it is, 8 trillion, 8 trillion, 8 billion people that exist in the planet. We can't bring them all in. We can't fix the problems we just can't do it. Right. So if we can't take everybody
Mm.
in, we have to think about like, if we want to make the world a better place, which I think is something that is important, obviously. And I think even I have this perspective of, God says to Abraham, I will bless you and you will be a blessing to many nations, essentially. But I'll bless you and you'll be a blessing. And I think that America has been blessed. And I do think there, and there's I'll get to a place where but there is a place where I do think there's a responsibility to also be a blessing. Now
Mm.
we've done that though, right? Here's the problem. We've spent so much time, energy, and effort as a country trying to be a blessing to the rest of the world that we've neglected our own country and our own children. It's
Right.
like we're at a place where we're kicking our own children out on the street in order to take
Yeah.
in foreigners into our house. Sorry, kids, we don't have enough food for everybody. We're going to have to kick you out so we can feed somebody we don't know, who we have no actual responsibility for. This is the challenging situation we're in right now. And half the problem is that we live in this constant state of cognitive dissonance around money,
Mm.
um, taxes, the national debt, and also free, quote unquote, free trade, which by the way isn't free when you're dealing with
Yeah.
countries that are nefariously messing with their currencies,
Like Chuck.
right? Like China, for instance. I don't think they like me. Probably, I like to go after them. So a lot of us do, right? But like anyway, but like I mean, so you kind of put all these things together, and it's really a recipe for disaster. And like when you talk about infrastructure just for fun, like I think this is probably I'd like to see some more data on this at this point, but like when Trump went into office, we were at a place where we were as a nation 5.5 million housing units shy of where we needed to be in order to house the current number of people that live in our country. So, just as an example of how we don't have the infrastructure to handle the current number of people who are living here, let alone take in more. But that's just like the infrastructure standpoint. That doesn't include, again, the cultural impact of bringing a whole bunch of people. Because if you have a community of 300 million people and you bring in 10 million people who have vastly different cultures, but you have a very strong culture, you can handle that as long, over a period of time, and they will eventually mix in and kind of adapt and adjust to the culture. But if you bring enough people in a short period of time, now I don't know if they will. Instead they may have more of an impact on the culture. And if they're coming from places that have cultural problems, then aren't they harming our culture, if that makes sense?
Right. I liked what you were saying earlier, how, America has, focused so much on other countries and other groups of people at the expense of its own citizens. Now, just one little anecdote about that. My mom, she works at Maine Eye Care, and she talks to a lot of patients all the time. She was talking to this one veteran, who was kicked out of his house. I think he lived in a rent controlled apartment, because he can't afford. He has medical issues and whatnot. He was kicked out of his apartment, and they put some homeless druggie in his apartment, and he had no place to live. He was homeless, and I think that speaks to a contempt that our elites have for us. I mean, you see it in Maine with Janet Mills, like in I believe it was 2018, there was a man in Kennedy Park in Lewiston who was beaten to death, I think with a rock, by a group of Somali teens. And, this was horrifying. I mean, there's a lot of crime in Lewiston, there's a high immigrant population there. But instead of, taking this as an opportunity to talk about, migrant crime, which is a big problem in Lewiston and in other parts of the country, Janet Mills held a protest in Kennedy Park. I think it was called Standing Up Against Hate. And, I think that speaks, there's a great term for this by Sir Roger Scruton. He was knighted by the English royal family. He's a, brilliant English philosopher, conservative. He coined this term called oikophobia. It's the opposite of xenophobia. Like xenophobia is an aversion toward the other, toward the alien, toward the outsider, someone that is not part of us. Whereas oikophobia is an aversion toward the domestic, toward the home, toward the hearth, toward us. And I think with a lot of our elites, they, because they grew up in a super zip, because they grew up, going to Ivy League schools, and they preach from their ivory towers all day, and they kind of live a very sheltered existence with private security, and they don't have to worry about crime and whatnot, that they are kind of isolated from these people. And you saw that same oikophobia, during the 2016 election, when, Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. You know, it's like, yeah, they have this utter contempt for Americans. And specifically, I'll say white Americans, because they also, hate conservatives and whatnot. But it's specifically, the patriotic white Americans, oftentimes blue collar, that's just trying to make ends meet. They see them as parochial, as bigoted, as an afterthought. And, the way that they, like, I remember, you know, Hillary Clinton was like, you know, if you're, you know, um, if your job was outsourced to China or whatever, because of NAFTA or whatnot, learn to code. Like any of these people living in Appalachia, whose only source of income comes from, one factory in their town that provides sustenance to everybody, to all the families there, like they can just go back to school and learn to code. It's so daft, it's so callous to say something like that, but that's how they are. That's how globalists are. They have no roots in the soil. They are rootless transnational elites at the end of the day. And I think that's what the great replacement is about, is they're trying to not they're not trying to diversify America. I mean, obviously, like on its face, America is becoming more diverse. There's a wider plurality of people. But really, with globalism, what you get with, free trade, the free movement of people, is not a strengthening of culture. It's this homogenization of culture. Like every single country is going to have a McDonald's. Everybody's going to be wearing Nike. That's really not diversity. Like
Well, it's a
when I try,
centralization of power is what that is.
yeah,
It's a
centralization of,
centralization of power through economics.
yeah, through economics, through global trade, through corporatization of everything. And that's kind of what you see. And like when I go to a different part of the country, like I want to hear people with an accent. When I go down south, I want to hear people, that talk like a southerner. When I go up to New England, I want to, see a salt of the earth, like, lobsterman. I want to feel the particularity of the places that I go to. But with and there's a term that a lot of people on in my political sphere use to describe this phenomenon. It's globo homo, global homogenization.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what has happened under our neoliberal elite, is just this homogenization of everything. Every building looks the same, all people walk and talk and act the same. And all of this is happening as, the world, or specifically America, is becoming more diverse. But I kind of wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier about immigration being a cultural thing. I do strongly believe that, like, a lot of these people that are coming from, North Africa and into Europe, they have a very different set of values. Like in Islam, if you apostatize from the religion, it's, the penalty in a lot of these countries is death. And, their treatment toward women is obviously very harsh in a lot of these countries. They can't even show any skin, they can't go to school. They have a very, they live in a very patriarchal society. So, when they come over, they have to wear a hijab and whatnot. And a lot of these countries, like France, I remember they were talking about. I don't know if they banned the hijab or whatnot, but anyways, like, yeah, there are definitely cultural components to this that are very significant. But I also think at the end of the day, there also are racial realities to it. Like, to a lot of people, race is important. Someone that comes over from another country, though they may not identify in the same way as, a black person identifies as being black in America, they see themselves as distinct and apart from the natives in a lot of these countries like Britain and France. Um, so in a way, like the racial aspect, a lot of people say race is skin deep. Um, and I mean, I don't think that's scientifically accurate. Like I mean, for example, if you want to know your genetic background, your ethnic background, you can order a little tube from a little DNA kit from 23andMe, and it could show you on a map, based on your genome, what genetic clusters match with your genome, and you can find out definitively what your racial background is. That's because race is real, and it isn't just skin deep. Like sickle cell anemia, for example, is a disease that's more common amongst Black people. Cystic fibrosis is far more common, far more prevalent amongst white people. It's because race is real. Like there are Caucasians, there are, Ashkenazi Jews, there are Asians. And, there's a lot of controversial science behind race, which is obviously very hotly contested. Um, but yeah, a lot of that data does have implications for your society if, these people are just coming over and, you know, transforming the country demographically. So, what do you think about that? Do you think that's kind of
Well, I
too
mean, well, I mean, like I think that you can't argue that there are differences that are beyond simply the color of the skin, right? 'Cause obviously, as you said, that there genetic, as you cited a few that are obvious for people who are aware of the medical field, but in terms of like how it impacts a culture, right? Like, something like that could have implications in terms of how it impacts healthcare, right? Like, let's say
Mm,
that a particular race of people had a higher rate of cancer or things like that, and then the amount of money that we have to spend as a culture on cancer treatment goes up as a result. First of all, I don't like that's not. I guess we can't ignore any consider like every. It can't just ignore things like that. But at the same time, like I don't. I'm not as concerned with that. In terms of how something impacts culture is how like their genetics are going to play into it. But so for me that doesn't. I don't. Yeah, I guess I don't see a problem with
well,
that,
I
even though
guess kind
it
of,
is a reality, if that makes
yeah.
sense.
I guess what I was
Like,
getting at is,
yeah,
you know, this is probably the most controversial thing I'll say is, we all acknowledge that uh, there are differences between individuals with regard to height, with regard to, incontrovertible things that they're just simply born with. Some people have a higher IQ, some people are smarter, some people are faster, stronger. We have no problem admitting that when it comes to differences between individuals. Now,
sure,
differences between groups is where people are like, okay, wait a minute. Because,
You're gonna
in the
talk about
early
fried. You're gonna talk about fried chicken.
no, no. Hey, I love fried chicken. I just had
Me
Popeyes the
too.
other night. But
Yeah.
so this is the controversial subject. It's been written a lot about by guys like Charles Murray, and others, is differences in IQ between the races. Which obviously, like, when people hear that, it's like, well, I know plenty of black people that are, for example, incredibly intelligent, as do I. Now, what's done in these scientific studies with regard to, differences between group, with regard to temperament and, intelligence and stuff like that, is you're dealing with statistical averages. Meaning, if you take one person out of a certain group, chances are they may be smarter or not as intelligent. But that doesn't exclude, or it doesn't mean that one group is inherently less smart than the other. You're just dealing with statistical averages. Now, what the science shows is that there are differences in life outcomes, which partly have to do with nature as much as nurture, as much as people's, genetics, as their upbringing, as their environment, as their education, as their standard of living and whatnot. But that reality does exist. And, you know, like, I'm not going to make a ranking, but generally speaking, Asians tend to have an IQ of 105. Whites tend to have an IQ of 100. Blacks tend to have an IQ of 85. And I believe Hispanics tend to have an IQ around 95 or 90. Um, but it's not, people hear that and they're like, well, do you think that white people are superior because they tend to have an higher IQ? I know plenty of white people that are dumb as nails. It's like, yeah, it's because you're dealing with statistical averages. But to deny wholesale that these realities exist belies the fact that, you know, if you look across America, in terms of educational performance and whatnot, like, these patterns keep showing up. Like, I mean, just to give an example, like, Harvard had to stop admitting a lot of East Asians because they perform so well on their SATs and whatnot. And you could say there's cultural reasons behind that, differences in parenting styles that influence their child's outcome. And that's obviously true. I mean, we all see that. We all know people who, grew up with a tiger mom that was like, you have to do well in school or else. And other people that are more lax and whatnot. And I see that in myself too. Like, I didn't do very well in school. I was kind of lazy. I procrastinated, and whatnot. I kind of marched the beat of my own drum. But these exist. And I think, if you go to a lot of countries, if you look at their average IQ, like, Haiti is going to be, I mean, it's just true, it's a lot lower than China. And this isn't like an argument for, racial superiority or anything, or that whites are superior, because actually the race that has the highest IQ is Ashkenazi Jews. And if you look at, their overrepresentation in society, in all these fields in academia and whatnot, they outperform so many other people. And I think we should celebrate these differences. And, like, with black people, there's a reason why they're overrepresented in long distance running, because of their muscle fibers, traits that they possess that are unique to them and their genetic background, that give them an inherent advantage in certain sports. So I think we should be able to talk about these things, and also admit when a lot of people come from these countries that tend to not. That's not to say that all Nigerians are going to have an IQ of 85 or whatnot. It's just they tend to. That when these people come over, it's going to be like a brain drain situation. And there's a great guy that wrote this book, called At Our Wits End. His name is Edward Dutton, and he's an English guy, a really eccentric chap, you could say. But he talks a lot about how throughout the Western world, our net IQ has been decreasing, and he doesn't blame that entirely on immigration. He's he's an evolutionary psychologist, you could say, and he believes that since the Industrial Revolution and advances in medicine and nutrition and medical care, we've basically eliminated these selection pressures, which kind of used to prior to the Industrial Revolution used to sort the genetic wheat from the chaff and whatnot. And that's not to say we should bring back all those things. Like, we want to live in a first world country. We don't want, you know, parents to have to worry about their child dying because we don't have penicillin. Or I'm not like a Luddite or anything. But basically he's saying, like, our IQ is decreasing. And I think a lot of that has to do with technology and whatnot and social media and a multitude of different factors. But all of this is to say, like, these differences do exist. And I don't think, and just as science advances, as genetic science advances, I mean, it's just becoming so apparent that race is real. And even if it wasn't real, the fact that it matters to so many people, black, white, and whatnot, like, human beings are tribal. And as the white share of the population declines, um, that does have, I mean, we are, you think that abhor, anti-white racism and stuff like that, as do I, and racism of all kinds. I think that anti-white racism is only going to get more pernicious, more pervasive, more prevalent as the white share of the population declines. Because, first of all, as it stands right now, we can't advocate for ourselves, as a collective group. With black people, with Jews, they have lobbying groups, they have advocacy groups. But if you're a white person and be like, hey, like, there's aspects of white culture, which does exist. White culture is a thing. It's not just like hot dogs and baseball and whatnot. It
Bar-
does exist.
barbecues,
Yeah, barbecues too. Yeah,
Hmm.
black people have great barbecues too, though.
They
Um,
do actually. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's not a white
yeah, yeah.
person thing for sure. It is an American thing, though. That's what matters
That's
to me.
true. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, what I'm saying is that yeah, we can't advocate for ourselves. And I feel like, I'm a dad. My daughter is white, obviously, because I'm as, pasty and white as they come. She's gonna grow up in a country, like, when she's around 18 and early adulthood, in the 2040s, America is projected to become majority minority in 2045. She's going to grow up in a completely different environment as I did when I was a kid. Like, part of the reason why my mom moved up to Maine was because it was whiter. And you could say that's white flight, you could say that's prejudice and whatnot. But my cousin Nick, who went to school in Southbridge, Massachusetts, he was bullied for being white, not for being conservative, not for being this, but because he was white and he didn't fit in with a lot of the Puerto Ricans and Hispanics that were there. Um, so I don't want her to grow up in an environment where she's where they're teaching CRT in schools, which CRT, it's bad. It's bad because it's anti-white. It is anti-white at its core, because they valorize all the other races, but white behaviors are seen as bigoted, as prejudiced. Like, I remember there was this one map that was making the rounds during BLM, which said that thrift and discipline and the Protestant work ethic was racist at its core. It's like, what? Like, being frugal and being disciplined and punctual and working really hard to make ends meet, is that racist? I don't think so. But yeah, I guess that's kind of my 2 cents. I know I just said a lot of controversial things, but
No, I mean, there are things. I think one of the problems, and that's why part of the reason I think that I really love the idea when I was listening to some of the Charlie Kirk show. What's funny is I didn't listen to the Charlie Kirk show when he was alive. I might have seen a couple of clips here and there, but it's only since he's passed, and I was listening to some of the not even the older episodes, because they're still continuing the show. And I was listening to, and I heard of this thought crimes, and it's like, you talk about the things that you're not supposed to talk about, and you ask the questions that you're not supposed to ask. Like, look, we can't be afraid to ask questions, right? Like,
Right.
what if, again, and part of the problem when you get into race is just how we've been programmed as a society, right? Because like white people like us, right? Like, I mean, you made some really good points. There's no white advocacy group in any country. Well, maybe not maybe there are in some other countries. I don't know.
People think of like the KKK, which is
right.
I
If
mean,
you're advocating for white people, you must be the KKK. Like, that's
exactly.
the connotation that's presented. Is
Right.
like, I wouldn't say that I don't care about white culture, but like, I feel like America's culture, which is not white culture, by the way, it's the American culture. Although America is predominantly white and basically always has been since we were settled. But I don't. Yeah. Anyway, I would say like American culture or white culture isn't something that I'm like incredibly tied to. Like, being a Christian, I believe in. I'm part of the body of Christ, which includes people of all races, in ethnicities, and obviously from the fact that if I could find it, married, a Rwandan, like, I don't like have this like fear or prejudice toward other races, but these are questions and conversations that I think it's important to have. I do like, it's interesting, like, one of the things that I think about as we're having this conversation is like, imagine, I mean, we don't have to imagine very hard, but imagine if there were like an African nation that ended up having the majority of the people who lived there somehow over a period of time shifted to being white. And then imagine how people in America would look at that. Right. Obviously, we wouldn't like it as a culture, not necessarily. We wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. I might not either, right? Like, so there is an element of like it not being a bad thing, but at the same, anyways, it's a really interesting concept in my mind, because I don't think in those terms.
I have a question for you, actually.
Sure.
So
Yeah. Go for it.
there are some countries in Africa. I believe Ethiopia is like 60% Christian. And it reminded me of a question that actually I think was asked to Charlie Kirk, because I remember this was making the rounds on X. I think he was asked by someone at one of his, Q&As, if America was, 100% Christian, but Indian, like pure ethnically homogenous toward Indian people, would you have a problem with that? And he said no. And, like, obviously you want to live in a Christian society. I think the most important aspect of a society is that it's moral, not that everybody looks the same and acts the same. Instead, it's moral first and foremost. You want families that are tight knit. You want healthy communities. You want a functional political system. All those are way more important than race. But I think to say that you'd be okay with something like that is to kind of turn a blind eye to the fact that, a lot of these things that we prize, that we care for in America, like, you know, having low crime, like in Maine, it's the whitest state in the country, and it also has the least crime. There is a correlation there. I mean, it's because if you go to like,
So I don't know that I agree. So like, if you like, I probably, I mean, I'd have to be convinced, I guess. And at this point, I'm the opposite of convinced, because like, when I look at the reason that that Maine has one of the lowest like crime rates in the country, I would suggest that it has a lot to do with the fact that Maine's very rural. It's one of the most rural states in the nation, one of the lowest population, but still, per people per capita, I think, for land area, like people per square footage or whatever the heck it is, I think that's another fact. Obviously, Alaska is much lower in that than we are.
Mm.
But I think like and maybe I could be persuaded relatively easily that it has a lot to do with more of the fact that Maine has a homogenous, is it homogenous? Is that the right word?
Homogenous, yeah.
Culture, right? That
Mm.
Maine is in large part, although, when you look at like Southern Maine versus, Maine is what they, the people in the rest of Maine, I feel like I'll do an ode to my old home state, we'll call it, which is
Mm.
that you have Maine, which a lot of us refer to as Northern Maine, and then you have what they like to call Northern Massachusetts, which is anything south of Lewiston. I always wonder why they choose to keep Lewiston, but they do. I think it's because it's part of Lewiston Auburn, and they want to keep Auburn, and so anyway.
Mm.
And so I think there's two distinct cultures between like that part of Maine and then southern Maine and coastal Maine. Um, but I think a lot of it has to do with like even with that. I mean, there's been a lot of change over the course of the last 10 years where, I mean, Maine, especially like the Portland area and the coast, has always been like we'll call it overpopulated with people from like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, Did I say Connecticut already? Probably. Rhode Island, wherever, New Jersey. There's a lot of people who are originally from there but have retired and moved up to Maine, and significantly skewed the culture, so it's not kind of as unified, I would say, as it used to be.
Mm.
But I think a lot of it has to do with that. Rather, yes, we are white, and that is one of the things to pay attention to. But I think it has a lot more. And this is where, in this conversation, I still think like
Mm.
race has very little to do with it, in my opinion, in my experience.
Mm.
It's the question is, are you, wherever you come from, are you assimilating to the culture? Because like when you have an assimilated culture, I don't think it matters what race people come from. If they can assimilate into that culture, then I think I think that it's fine. But if they can't, and there's
Mm.
something that's holding them back, I think that's where more of these tensions arise. And I think that's part of the reason, when you have like really diverse areas, sometimes you do have a lot more crime, and I think a lot more distrust of different groups of people, because sometimes we talk about like gang mentality, right? Like somebody, you saw you're a white person, a black person did something to a white person, and so your brain does something. Like, so we're having some problems right now
Mm.
in Lewiston, and probably in Portland to a degree. But one of the stories that has come out is this young girl on a school bus it was videotaped, and she was beat up. She was one of the only white girls that. So one of the schools in particular is almost segregated. Essentially, you've got a really high percentage of immigrant students that are going to this school, and a very few white students, essentially. Um, and so there's one of the white girl on a bus largely full of black girls, and a bunch of girls she doesn't know, and they just start beating her up, right?
Yeah.
And they end up getting suspended, but this girl now is afraid to go to school, right? And to ride the bus. And so the mom is forced to, basically, because the school isn't going to take those two kids and tell them, well, you viciously beat a student, to the point where she was like in a coma. I don't know, she wasn't in a coma, but she had a concussion, and she spent a period of time in the hospital. And so, like, if anything, if this girl doesn't feel safe, then the response is, well, they are the perpetrators. I don't, they shouldn't be able to ride the bus unless
Mm.
somehow they can find a way to make this girl feel safe with them
Yeah.
riding the bus. If a solution can be made through that kind of a process, okay. If not, they've lost their privileges to the bus, right? But that's
Right.
not how things work, right? Because in
Mm.
the current situation, they're going to like let this is part of the problem that we're having in our culture here in Maine, I think, is that they basically have a separate set of rules, because they've decided, because they're Marxists, right, that whoever appears to be the most you know, the most disadvantaged you need to treat them the best. And so these are children of migrants, and so therefore we're going to let them get away with stuff, whereas the white kids, we're going to actually hold them to a higher standard. That creates culture, that creates racial tensions, right? Like if you just had consistent rules for everybody and forced everybody to hold to the same standard, I mean, would there to a degree? Yeah, I mean, kids are kids. I remember years ago, I was working as part of like a swimming lessons thing, and I was teaching like our swimming lessons group. There was one that they would rotate the kids out, so they would either be doing arts and crafts, swimming, or sports and games, and I was the sports and games guy. Oh, what happened here? Looks like we might have lost him. So give us just a minute. We'll hopefully get Forrest back in the room. So, well, anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened. I'd like to consider this story, but I also want to tell Forrest. So, I'll take this moment to say, hey, if you haven't checked out our website yet, muddywaters.us. We have a lot of fun stuff there, a lot of merch. If you want to support the podcast, you believe in what we're doing, you can get some nice pins, we also have coffee. So we're the Muddy Waters podcast, but we call it the Clear Stream Coffee Co. because even the waters of Maine politics are muddy. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is clear the water and make it clear so that you can see what's going on and you can navigate a path through everything that's going on, here in Maine, but also, hopefully maybe we'll try to focus a little bit more on national politics in the future. Although that's kind of what we're talking about today, a little bit of a bigger conversation. But ultimately we're largely focused on the state of Maine and trying to help people better understand what's going on here in our state. It looks like Forrest might be back, although I don't see a picture yet. Oh, there we go. We're back. Oh, good. No, you're good. I just took it as an opportunity to tell people to go to my website, check it out, but also find our shorts on all the whether it's Instagram, TikTok, X, Facebook, or YouTube. Find us, like, share, subscribe, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere. But definitely check out the shorts. Those are the easiest bits to be able to share with people, to get people to be, learn more about what's going on through those targeted shorts. But to go back to what I was talking about, so yeah, I was leading the swimming lessons, sports and games, and there was this because we are a white state largely, and especially back then, even more so, there was one black kid, and one kid just called him Blackie. Right. And just like he didn't know what to call him. And so he just referenced him based on the color of his skin. And it just highlights that I think one of the things that tends to happen is we as humans are flawed. We're broken. We're fallen. And so this was simply a matter of this kid recognizing a difference between himself and that child. Right. And it was harmless. However, like as we jockey for position, we tend to look for anything. It doesn't matter. Do you wear glasses? We're going to call you Four Eyes. Do you, like, whatever it is, we're going to look for something about you to decide that makes us better than you, right? There's a broken human nature, flawed human nature, that causes us to be in a position where we're going to try to find something about somebody else that we can tear them down with to elevate ourselves. That's always going to exist in society. If it's not race, it's going to be something else. But I don't know if all that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm really glad you told me about that story of that girl in Lewiston on the bus. I had no idea that happened. So my daughter actually, with my ex, who I co-parent with, currently lives in Lewiston. And I remember hearing of another incident of this woman who was walking around with her daughter, who I think was also a toddler like my daughter, and a black guy tried to kidnap the kid right while she was going about her business. What, for 1 second, wasn't paying attention, and got her, kid almost kidnapped. And of course, she got her kid back. Everything turned out okay. But I think to say that that has nothing to do with race, that it's all cultural, I don't agree with. Like, I mean, just look at what happened to that Ukrainian girl in North Carolina who was, killed by that black guy. What did he say after he had, killed her, stabbed her for no rhyme or reason? He said, "I got that white girl. I got that white girl." Now, I've talked to some people about this and they're like, "Oh, well, he was a schizophrenic. He was, a repeated offender, had been arrested 13 times." Well, why was he arrested 13 times? Is it only because of mental illness? And I also say, why didn't all the black people help this, white girl as she was bleeding to death? Why did, one black guy, instead of helping her, decide to take his phone out and film her? It's like, would the reaction of people been different if there were some white people on the subway? Would they have felt a more kinship toward Erna, the girl that was senselessly killed? And I'd say the same for that girl in Lewiston. You said all the people on that bus were black people. Why didn't any of them help the girl out? I'm sure there were some people on there that thought to themselves, "Oh, like that's violence. That's abhorrent. Like I want to help her. Why is she being beaten up?" Well, I'm sure many of them felt that way, but they felt like they can't help her because they feel that kinship with their own people. And I don't want my kid to grow up around that. I just don't. And I think my politics, my views on race and demographic transformation is all kind of downstream from that because this is real. I mean, look what happened to Austin Metcalf. He told, at this track event or football event or whatever, that, he told a guy politely, like, "You're in my friend's seat." And then this black kid took out a knife and stabbed him and he died. And after, everybody said that, Carmelo Anthony, the guy that killed Austin Metcalf, is innocent. And people started a GoFundMe where all these black people were donating money to basically get him acquitted. And I think you see this, it happened in 92 with the Rodney King riots, which, I mean, understandable why a lot of black people were angry because Rodney King was senselessly beat by a group of cops that were racist. And, the video made the rounds and people were rightfully angry. But what did they do when that happened? They rioted. And there were people that died in the riots. What happened after Charlie Kirk died? We had vigils, we had these good faith conversations. We didn't riot, we didn't loot stores. And I feel like you always see this senseless violence, from certain groups of people. And I don't want to be around that. It's not to say that they're all like that, obviously not. But
Well, this is where I think that I think that race is obviously part of the
yeah,
conversation in why this is happening, but it's not. I do think that the primary issue here is actually, so there's two things: that both white people and black people can be racist. Okay,
yeah,
right? Contrary to popular belief, doesn't matter what skin color you are, you can be racist. And so to say that a black man who probably definitely had some mental health issues, you don't stab a white girl sitting on a train doing nothing. If you're right in your mind, right? That's no person who's right in their mind does that,
mm,
right? However, for him, obviously there was a racial element, and so to say that there are some black people for whom there is a racial identity where they care about their own race above other races, right, is true. But that's where this is this is quite complicated, but that's not it's not the same, I guess, is the point that I'm getting at. It's it's not it's a cultural issue, because and at this point, we know that there, when you look at voting trends and things like that, that a significant portion of what happened with the BLM riots and a lot of this stuff is impacted by politics and it's funny. I had this friend who I won't cite her name, but she was always talking to me about the Illuminati, and how the government's basically actively trying to keep the black man down. And what's interesting is you go back to Lyndon B. Johnson, who was when you were referencing that other thing that you thought was JFK, by the way, that was actually under Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
Lyndon B. Johnson. So who was the president under whom a lot of problems actually began to arise
Great
in the
society.
African American community.
Yeah.
And and just had a lot of so like there are systemic problems that do exist that were created right actually by Democrats, right? And so I think that, again, this is not to absolve anyone in the African American community who has bought into nonsense and committed crimes and all this other kind of stuff. And like, if you make a decision not to have the husband, the father of your child, and stay in relationship with him so you can get government benefits, whatever it ends up being, and this happens in white rural communities in Maine as well. That doesn't, like, just because somebody else pushed you to do it, that doesn't change the fact that you made a decision. So again, this is where a lot of this, and I think this is a lot of the stuff that Charlie Kirk was talking about. This is cultural, right? And there is a racial component simply because people are either one race or another. And some of the cultures within the races do tend to gravitate toward a higher value of their own race than other races, right? But this is one of the problems, and breakdowns. I think one of the things that Charlie Kirk said is one of the, I don't love absolutely everything he said, I think, for the record. But one of the things that I loved is, like, he only talked about race because the left was talking about it. He actually literally says, like, I don't care about race. I really don't see it. Like, obviously I can tell that somebody's black or somebody's white, but I don't see it. And I want a world where we don't talk about it at all. But I have to communicate in basically in the language of the culture, which includes talking about this nonsense, especially if you're going to make it out. And this is what he was combating, that the only reason that black people have any problems in this culture is because white men have kept them down. It's like, well, it's just not true. And he would always say, name something that I can do that you can't do. And they could never come up with anything. And so he would talk about this, but again, ultimately we were looking for a culture that we can have where we're not thinking about that. We're not worried about that. Morgan Freeman would say the same thing, like that the best way essentially to eliminate racism is to stop talking about it, right? That the more we focus on it, the worse it becomes. More we're like, well, and so like like a lot of it is culture. I think that's the predominant thing. And again, there is a racial element in some cultures, but it's really the culture that's the problem. Race is like it's like part of the equation, but it's not one of the variables, if that makes sense.
Right.
Or maybe I don't know. Just it's not. It's like it doesn't have to be one of the variables.
Right.
If people choose to make it one, then it is one. But I think that's a choice that we make.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I definitely like Thomas Sowell. He's a black economist. He's written so many great books on this topic. One book, whose name escapes me, but I think it was like Black Rednecks and White something. And he talked a lot about how the black culture in the South actually came from, and I'm kind of, recalling this from memory. I don't remember verbatim exactly his argument, but he said that a lot of, the cultures that we see amongst the black community actually came from rural whites in England who, had not to say that they had a bad culture or something, but there is that cultural intermingling and whatnot, and culture is a very powerful force. I guess what I would say is I don't really care so much whether it's cultural or racial. I want to live in a community that's safe, and I want, yeah, and I mean it goes without saying, but like I'd much rather live in like Cape Elizabeth than I would in the south side of Chicago. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah,
And
or in a trailer park.
yeah, and a lot of people,
right?
a lot of people will say that's like that's racist, that's prejudice, but I guess at the end of the day is you can refuse to see race. Like when I talk to people like my coworkers or whatnot, there's a lot of black people I work with, Asian people. I really like on an individual basis when I'm interacting with people, I don't give a crap what your race is. Like as long as you're a good person. I mean, I think most people, I mean, you really have to be very like deeply have a really hardened heart to not treat everybody you interact with respect. But I guess what I'll say is even if you refuse to see race, even if you choose to adopt that kind of colorblind mentality. Even if you refuse to see race, race will always see you. You'll always be a white guy. I'll be a white guy. You'll be a white guy. And that's going to affect our life. It affects our lives now, and it affects other people who are of a different race now. But in the future, as like I said, the white share of the population declines, you know, your identity as a white person will only become more salient to you because, you know, the neighborhoods you'll be in, the, you know, the bars you'll go to, the restaurants you'll go to, it'll be different culturally, it'll be different racially, and, you know, that has far-reaching implications. Um, so I guess, you know, whether it's cultural, whether it's racial, it doesn't matter so much to me as just the texture of life transforming for myself and, you know, for my children. That's kind of like what my fear is. And honestly, it doesn't even necessarily need to be racial. Like there's a lot of white places that I don't want to go to, like Lynn, Massachusetts is, you know, disproportionately white. It's not a safe area. Like, and there's a lot of places in Maine where I'm like, "Ah, I don't want to be around here." You know what I mean? Um,
I
but
could tell you a few, but we'll not shame them on air.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, I guess yeah, do you have any more thoughts on that? Any
No, I mean, again, I think I would contend that, like, you know, I still like, I'll still hold, I guess, to, the issues that there are, you know, like Charlie Kirk had said that there are issues in certain, you know, African American communities, and the culture within the broader African American community in the United States of America. But I think, like, just like, you know, I would argue with people who are saying that that's as a result of systemic racism or whatever, is that it's actually like a lot of it is socioeconomic. Now, not a lot of what's like Lewiston's a different story because you're dealing with a lot of like high immigrant population, a lot of Somalis and Somali culture, which is they're not really assimilating to the United States, and so that's a different animal. Not that they're animals for people if you're listening and you think that you're not listening, so turn to another station. um but like it's a different, it's, you know, it's a different conversation than like the historic, you know, basically descendants of slaves that have been in America that were impacted by, you know, basically they're different cultures. It's funny, the Africans and then African Americans or blacks or however you want to put it, like, first generation immigrant Africans have a very different different culture, than your black, you know, African Americans, who have been here largely since slavery. And the culture there is that culture is much, there is a I would say a racial element, but it's in a lot of ways, a lot of the problems that you see is the same thing that you see in white trash America. That's what I call it, trailer parks. That's where I would put white trash America. And a lot of it is as a result of that stuff that Lyndon B. Johnson rolled out, that destroyed families in more impoverished communities, and damaged their ability to escape. So if you test out and you eliminate race, but just pay attention to socioeconomic status, you're going to find very similar things across. And then you take a look at race again, you're going to find that very similar things based on race. The difference is when that type of stuff got rolled out, you had, I think one of the elements anyway is that you had, you know, a higher percentage of the African American community who were making their way and advancing, but hadn't made it to like the ones that hadn't made it to middle class yet, which is a substantial percentage of the blacks that were in America. That they got hit by that. And whereas, like, obviously the white population wasn't as much in that impoverished area, that impoverished segment of the population, and continues. But I think that's a big element there. And I had another thought, but
Mm,
but overall, I think it's so much less about race than it is about a lot of these other factors. And ultimately, I feel like this is another play of the globalists, that they want us to divide based on things that don't matter, that they can make us get distracted by. They're trying to get the liberals, for instance, to focus on how bad and awful whites are, and I think they're also trying to distract us with some of this other stuff. And I think that's a thing we need to be very, very careful about, because it's not. I think that, yes, there are definitely some differences, and I'd be interested to go back to some of the stuff that you were saying early on about like
mm,
the IQ stuff, because I had seen some stuff in the past, and I did a little bit of digging into it, and I decided that I would just completely throw it out, and say that the testing was completely invalid,
mm,
and yet people were citing it as reasons to talk about people from a couple of different countries in Africa, which I'm not going to go into in
mm,
detail at the moment. But it was, like when you actually did some digging, and you understood a little about the cultures, very important,
mm,
right? And where the tests were being taken and things like that. It's like, well, I mean, that's where we have to be careful, because even like, obviously we're talking about IQ tests in general. The liberals will be like, IQ test, that was to make white people better than the black people in the first place. And obviously that's silly, but I'm not sure if that was initially part of it. But the reality is, like, an
mm,
IQ test has the potential to help us ascertain like how much potential there is in someone. But if people coming into the IQ test don't know some of the basic terms, and other people coming to the test do know some of the basic terms, and by knowing those
mm,
terms are able to score better, it doesn't say anything actually differentially about one's aptitude over against another. And therein lies some of the problems. That's where I would want to know more about where
mm.
those studies came from, because if they're taking into account some of the studies that I'm aware of, like, I would just, like, we got to start over. Yeah. So anyway, that's a
Yeah.
subplot,
Yeah.
but
Well,
yeah.
with regard to the IQ studies, there's just been, I mean, especially as the science as has advanced, like, we've mapped the human genome, we can identify genetic clusters and specific genes that code for certain behaviors, like the warrior gene and whatnot. The science has just advanced so much, and IQ tests have become much more fine-tuned. Like, you brought up how, certain IQ, and this was especially the case in the early 1900s when they were less advanced. There was biases within the tests, and they were, prejudice and whatnot. Um, but now you have, pattern recognition tests, which, you can give to anyone regardless of their culture and whatnot, and have them recognize, like, shapes, and what shape comes next. There's a certain test, I forget the name of it, that they often give, but it's often very accurate. And there's also been like twin studies as well, where they've, taken a black kid who was, adopted by a white family, which is of a very high socioeconomic status, and they tested the black child's IQ early on in life, and it was the same as, the white child within the same family. But as that child reached adolescence, despite growing up in the same environment, in a stable family, a middle class life, there was like a difference in IQ. Now they were higher than the average, 85 for, black people. They were a couple points higher, but still lower. And I think when you look at educational attainment, in places that are, you know, higher in terms of socioeconomic status, you still see those differences in attainment in educational achievement amongst race. And that's not to say that like white people are smarter, because oftentimes, in many places, white people are underperforming compared to other groups. But yeah, I think, I mean, there's a great website called Human Biological Diversity, and it just has a plethora of studies that go into this. Obviously, it is a contested subject. Like a lot of people bring up the Flynn effect, which talks about how, like, as countries have become more industrialized and have advanced in terms of medicine and nutrition and standard of living, you have seen an increase in IQ. Um, but I think the increase is marginal. And even Richard Flynn, or I think that was his name, he actually, I was watching a video today on this topic. It was a debate between Richard Taylor and E. Michael Jones. Richard Taylor, or not Richard Taylor, Jared Taylor. He's the founder of American Renaissance, and E. Michael Jones is a Catholic writer, founder of the magazine Culture Wars, and they were debating, the significance of race. E. Michael Jones is a Catholic and doesn't believe that race exists as a biological reality and is a significant thing in the development of societies, whereas Jared Taylor takes a more, scientific approach to it, a more evolutionary approach. And Jared Taylor had actually said that Richard Flynn acknowledged that those differences could exist. And a lot of studies actually they were gonna, I think this was at Harvard, they were developing an IQ test based on DNA, and the study, they weren't able to develop it because it was shut down. And that's what you see a lot in academia. The reason why, this topic hasn't, reached a level of advancement is, like, say, quantum mechanics, is because it's very controversial. Because as soon as you start talking about it, people are like, oh, you think, you know Asian people are smarter than Australian Aborigines? Like, that's racist, that's prejudice. But I mean, it's science, and people should be
Facts
able to.
don't care about your feelings, right? Facts don't care about your feelings, and if it's a fact, it's a fact. And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, is like one of the things I like about the idea of having this conversation is that we have to be willing to ask questions with an open mind, regardless of the potential consequences. And again, part of the problem with this is because, like, people attach value and to, like, whether or not, like, again, we all know, again, there's a reason that Harvard basically requires Asians to have a substantially higher SAT score on average to be able to attend than other races, right? And so the highest has to, like, Asians have the highest level, whites below that, and then blacks are below. And there's a reason, it would seem, that is the case. And like, we have to be willing to talk about reality. And again, it's not racist to say that people are different. And like, I think that there's no race that's less than another race, but there may be
Yeah.
races that have different strengths and weaknesses.
Just as individuals do. Like,
One hundred percent, right?
I don't
Yeah.
understand why we can openly acknowledge, like, in school, like, I was, put in a reading comprehension class. I remember I was having difficulties, with reading. I didn't learn how to read until I was in first grade, so I was kind of behind. And you know, it- and like, I'm skinny, I'm shorter, I'm 5'6.5". Like, these are differences I was born with. Like, it's, I don't think I have reading comprehension skills. I think they tested me wrong. But, like, still, like, I felt, disadvantaged. I felt at the time I was, behind all these other people. So I'm sympathetic to, even liberals who think that, this kind of conversation is beyond the pale, because nobody should feel lesser than because of something, that they can't control, that they were born with. Like, you're born a certain race, you're born a certain height, you're born a certain, you know, and whatnot. We can't control these things. That's why the nature nurture conversation has always been a hot button topic, like, between liberals and conservatives. And I just think, we're so quick to say everything is environmental. We're like blank slates, and the only reason why we fail in life is because of, how much money we have, or because of where we live, or because of, the schools that we go to. But really, I think a lot of it, more than we'd like to admit, has to do with genetics. Um, and it's just the way it is. Like, intelligence is largely heritable from your parents, typically from your mother. Um, and everything from your weight to your whether when you pee, it's, you can smell the asparagus after eating it, like all the like little things, whether you have earwax of a certain texture. Like, I mean, I know this because I did 23andMe, and it showed me whether I'm likely to have freckles or likely to have blonde hair or blue eyes. Like, all of this stuff has to do with genetics, and I think it's beautiful, because, like, I think, a lot of this comes down to, we want to feel like we're in control of our lives. We want to feel like if we're in a certain place at a certain time and we do a certain thing, that we'll be able to get what everybody else has that we want, like success, like money, like, love and whatnot. But a lot of those things, for a lot of people, are out of the reach for stuff that we can't control. And that sucks. But you also got to think, a lot of the best things in life come from, stuff that you can't control. Like, I can't control that I'm alive. Some people wish they weren't alive, but it's the most beautiful gift that you had no control over. You didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose to be born in America. I'm glad I was born in America. I didn't control that. And you can't control the weather, but, like, if it snows on Christmas, it's like, that's special because it's unpredictable. And I remember I did a photo shoot. Sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I did a photo shoot with my daughter recently, and I was talking to the photographer. He does a lot of wedding photography and whatnot, and he was talking about how, like, the best photos that he takes are the ones that are unplanned, when, like, someone is saying their vows and they start to cry, and you capture that because you can't control crying. Like, you don't control your feelings control you. When you see something like a touching movie, or you hear a beautiful song and you get goosebumps or you start to cry, you can't control that. It's involuntary. And I feel like, you know we take for granted all the things that we can't control. And yeah, a lot of that is stuff that we wish we had, which we don't. But a lot of it is stuff that we should be grateful for. And I'm grateful that I'm white. You should be grateful that you're black. And not you specifically, but I'm just talking like,
I'm only half black because I married an African, so that's
yeah,
what I
but
was told.
your wife should be grateful
We're
that she
we're
was born in
yeah,
Kenya, which is a beautiful
we're
country.
Rwanda, but she lives in
Rwanda,
Kenya.
sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Rwanda, a beautiful country. Like, these places are beautiful because they're different.
Yeah.
America's beautiful because it's different from China. China's beautiful because it's different from Britain. So I feel like differences make all the difference, even if we can't control them, you know? So I guess, yeah, that's kind of my yeah.
2 cents on that. Well, it was more than 2 cents. But but yeah,
Couple
no,
dollars maybe.
absolutely. Man, anyway, my brain's taking me back to places I shouldn't go. High school. Anyway, but yeah, no, it's like it's a great conversation. I think, again, to your point, like, it's there's a lot of beauty, and we shouldn't be like, again, one of the things that I think is just clear that we believe as conservatives at this point is, like, we definitely shouldn't be ashamed of being white. And like, nor should we feel superior because we're white. You know what I mean? And as you said, one of the things you were saying earlier, I think, is so true. And there's this biblical passage, and we'll see if I can quote it right, about control, right? And it says that man plans, or yeah, a man basically creates his plans for where he's going to go, but the Lord directs his path, right? Essentially, that you think, even when we think we're in charge and we're in control and we're making a plan, God, who is ultimately in control. He's sovereign. This is the belief. Sorry if you're not a believer out there, but like this is what I believe, and I believe this to be true. And I've seen this also in my life, right? It plays out over and over and over again, where I'm like, sometimes I beat my head up against the door, and it just is like, no, you're not going there. Sorry. Like, and when you look at it, it's like none of this makes any sense. I absolutely should be able to go there. It makes perfect sense for me to be able to go. Why am I not able to go? And it's because there's somebody else who's in control of all of this. And I would be puzzled over it with like some career things with one of my coworkers, where for some of the things that like it made perfect sense for the company to have promoted me and given me opportunities and treated me because of like I was a really good employee. I did a lot of but I wasn't like, I had to fight for like all of my promotions, and like and I had to go for the jobs that nobody else wanted. Whereas for other people, they get, like, it was like they didn't even ask for it, and they're like, "Here's a raise." What is going on here? And they weren't better employees than me. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, but and so they had all these types of situations, and you have to wonder like what's going on here. And it's ultimately that there's, again, I think that there's somebody else who's in control of these things. And for a lot of years I tried to leave that company and I never could, and then all of a sudden I did, and I'm like, how did that happen? And that was last April actually. But anyway, I think it's like that's the reality. I think that God is ultimately in control, and once we let go of this need and feeling for control and just try to do the best that we can with what we have, with the opportunities that we're given, I think we can move in a very positive direction. And it's a good lesson for myself to be reminded of, because I feel like right now I'm like, I have to. This is like everybody's got a little bit of a God complex, right? Like that they're like, well, if I, one of the best examples was, for me was thinking, that like, okay, so you saw what happened in Germany leading up to World War II, right? And how so many people, or even after World War II, were like, once the average German was it was revealed to them, because some of them didn't know what was happening in the concentration camps, right? And they were like, we had no idea. And it's like, I said to myself, like learning about that, I was like, I'm never going to be that person, right? And so I'm going to be aware. So even though I wasn't like engaged and involved in politics, I sought to be aware. And I thought, like, so that if anything does like happen or look like it's going to happen, I'll be there to help stop it. And like the amount of hubris that I had in that moment, and 2020 just like totally destroyed that. It's like, I see it, I can't do anything to stop it. There's no, like, it's this like reminder that I think we often have this like idea that, oh my gosh, look what I'm going to do. And like sometimes in a much lower, like, I feel like I gotta figure out what we can do strategically. How do we like stop Maine from falling into the ocean? And like the reality is like we don't, God does. And I need to figure out if there's anything that I can do to help in that process, but I need to let go a little bit. So anyway, that's the lesson of the day for me. But thank you again for coming on. This has been a really fun conversation. Before we depart, do you have any final words? If people want to follow you, where can they find you? Or do you want followers?
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, I do make some pretty hot takes on my X account, but yeah, you can follow me on X. I need to change it. I remember when we first met, you were like, yeah, like I changed my to my Twitter account, and you like lost your like verification badge for a little while. I still have to change mine. It's like Foz and then like 10 digits. It's like no one's gonna remember that. I don't remember it off the top of my head. But yeah, I can trying to think. I mean, if you just maybe
we'll at you in the comments on X.
That's
follow me on X if you don't already follow me on X, at Muddy Waters ME, and or just search for Chuck Ellis and you should find me, and then find this conversation and find Forrest. There you go. All right. Well, thanks again. We'll have to have you on again. We got to figure out. All we have to do is figure out what the next topic is going to be, because clearly once the ball's rolling, first of all, you can talk, and I can talk, and so we
I'm
can
a yapper.
but it's a great conversation. So look forward to the next one. And everybody else, we'll see you back here tomorrow. I think there's a city council. I should know more about this, but there's a controversy in Wyndham. And I think there's a city councilor who's, I don't know if he's being accused of some things or some information has come to light. And he's being come to light just before the election. So we're going to have him on and hear, I guess, his side of the story tomorrow. So check us out tomorrow. See you guys.